A woman was found dead in her own home, but detectives couldn't find a single clue to explain what had happened. At first, it seemed like the answer would be simple, but the deeper they dug, the more unexpected the case became. In the end, they were able to uncover the truth, but no one could have predicted just how shocking it would be. Randi Trimble was born on December 15, 1974 in Virginia. She was an only child, raised by her mom on her own. From a young age, Randi was drawn to the arts. She played the flute, acted in school plays, and even was part of the school band. After graduating high school, she went on to study at Bloomsburg University in Pennsylvania, where she studied to become a speech therapist. Randi had a real passion for working with kids and gave it everything she had. Her mom was working multiple jobs to cover her tuition, and Randi didn't take that for granted. She kept her grades very high and eventually earned a scholarship that covered her entire graduate program. During college, she also started dating a guy named Brian. Not long after graduation, the two got married. But what should have been one of the happiest moments in their lives came with heartbreaking news. Just before the wedding, Brian was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a serious degenerative illness that could lead to permanent disability. Still, Randi didn't walk away. She stayed by his side and promised to support him no matter how the disease progressed. The couple settled in the small town of Camp Hill, where Randi landed a solid job at a local medical center. With that steady income, she was able to buy a house, and from there, she and Brian started building a life together. They dreamed of having kids and were putting money aside in case Brian's condition got worse and he could no longer work. To make sure they'd be financially secure, Randi even took on a second job, despite already earning a solid income from her full-time position. January 10, 2003 started out like any other day. Randi, who was 28 at the time, went to work at the hospital and finished her shift around 5 p.m. After that, she headed to her second job, stayed there for a few hours, and then went home. Brian had finished work a bit earlier that day, but he'd made plans to meet up with a friend in a nearby town around 8 p.m. He got back home, and right away, he could tell something wasn't right. The house was dark, and Randi didn't seem to be there. Inside, the house was a mess. Things were scattered across the floor like someone had torn the place apart looking for something. Brian checked every room, called out for Randi, but she was nowhere to be found. Eventually, he stepped into the garage and was met with a heartbreaking scene. Randi was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, with a strand of Christmas lights wrapped tightly around her neck. He immediately called 911, but it was too late. All paramedics could do was pronounce her dead. Police turned Randi's body over to the medical examiner and began combing through the crime scene. But there wasn't much to go on. There was no sign of forced entry, no murder weapon, and no obvious clues pointing to a suspect. Forensics collected every fingerprint they could find and sent them off to the lab, hoping one of them might belong to the killer. They also discovered that some cash and a few of Randi's valuables were missing, including a gold diamond ring. Meanwhile, the medical examiner made a chilling discovery. Randi had been stabbed 27 times. That's what ultimately killed her. The examiner also noted that the killer had tried to strangle her, but failed. There were no signs of sexual assault, so at first glance, it looked like Randi had been killed during a robbery. One of the windows in the house had been left unlocked, and detectives believed the killer might have gotten in that way. But right from the start, they had serious doubts about that theory. The level of violence suggested something far more personal, and soon, they started looking at her husband as a potential suspect. Friends and family told investigators that Randi and Brian had been having some problems in their marriage. Most of it centered around Brian's illness. Randi was always preparing for the worst, trying to save as much money as possible in case his condition got worse. Brian, on the other hand, didn't want to think about any of that. He felt like they shouldn't have to live every day in survival mode. Those differences led to a lot of arguments, and for detectives, that was enough to see it as a potential motive. Still, detectives quickly confirmed that Brian had a solid alibi. The medical examiner put Randi's time of death at around 7:30 p.m., but at that exact moment, Brian was in another town meeting up with a friend. Police checked it out and confirmed he'd been at a cafe with several customers and employees backing up his story. There simply wasn't enough time for him to drive home and commit the murder. The town where he met his friend was about an hour away, so police ruled him out as a suspect. Randi's family stood by him too, insisting there was no way he could have hurt her. And honestly, detectives weren't sure he even had the physical strength to pull off something that violent. His condition was still in the early stages, but Brian was already having a hard time with anything physical. With Brian ruled out, police turned their attention to other possible suspects. But the complete lack of evidence made things incredibly difficult. Forensics hadn't found any usable fingerprints, no DNA, and nothing else that could point them in the right direction. So detectives started focusing on the people closest to Randi, still convinced that the motive was personal. They spoke with her friends and co-workers, but no one could think of a single person who might have wanted to hurt her. Randi didn't have enemies, and in recent years, she'd been fully focused on her family. Weeks went by with no progress. Detectives had no solid leads and no other suspects, so eventually, they found themselves circling back to Brian, wondering if there was any possible way he could have pulled this off. Even though Brian's alibi held up, his behavior after the murder raised some eyebrows. Not long after Randi's death, he moved to another town to be closer to his family and started skipping work regularly. He also completely cut off contact with Randi's mother, even though they'd been very close before. What really caught people's attention was how he suddenly started spending money. Brian bought a new TV, an Xbox, decked out his place with brand new furniture, and started buying all sorts of stuff he definitely didn't need. His friends tried to talk to him about it, but Brian just brushed it off, saying, "Grieving can get expensive." He also mentioned he was expecting insurance payouts, one for the stolen jewelry and another for Randi's death. In the meantime, he said he was dipping into the savings they had built together. Brian's behavior definitely raised some red flags, but as long as his alibi held, there wasn't much police could do. So they decided to dig a little deeper and went to speak with his co-workers. Brian worked in the IT department at an insurance company, and detectives started asking around to see if anyone had noticed anything unusual. That's when they got something interesting. One woman who knew Brian fairly well told investigators that he used to talk a lot about the problems in his marriage. According to her, he often complained that Randi was too controlling, constantly monitoring their spending and making him feel like he couldn't live his own life. Things had gotten so bad, she said, that just a few weeks before Randi's death, Brian told his co-workers he was planning to file for divorce. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, he changed his tune. He started insisting everything was fine between them and that divorce was no longer on the table. Before wrapping up the interview, the woman suggested detectives talk to another co-worker, someone Brian had been especially close to. The co-worker's name was Blaine, and like Brian, he worked in the IT department. The two had hit it off over their shared love of video games and horror movies. Blaine had even written a script for a low-budget film he dreamed of making one day, something in the style of the Blair Witch Project. Brian loved the idea, and the two of them talked about it non-stop at work. But according to another co-worker, something shifted in the weeks before Randi's murder. The movie talk stopped. So did the usual video game banter. Instead, they started keeping to themselves, whispering quietly like they didn't want anyone else hearing what they were saying. After hearing this, detectives started to wonder if Blaine knew something about Randi's death. But instead of dragging him in for questioning right away, they decided to play it smart and see if they could get more out of Brian first. They kept in regular contact with Brian, checking in under the pretense of following up on small details. By then, he was used to the constant questions. But this time, detectives asked him to revisit the crime scene and walk them through everything that had happened on that fateful night. Brian agreed, and that's when things got interesting. As he walked them through the moment, he found Randi's body. His story didn't match what he told them just weeks earlier. Back then, he said he hadn't touched her and called 911 right away. Now he claimed he had held her hand and pulled her into his arms. There were other inconsistencies too, small details that didn't match up with his earlier statements. To detectives, it was a red flag. From that point on, they kept the pressure on. They stayed in contact with Brian, not so much to get new information, but to keep him on edge, nervous, and constantly aware that police were watching him. They even tapped his phone and started following him everywhere. He went, making sure he knew it. That continued until detectives were ready to move into the final phase of their plan. In early May, 5 months after Rye's murder, they brought her husband in for another interview and started laying out their suspicions. They laid it all out. Brian's odd behavior, the holes in his story, the spending, the things his co-workers had said. Then one of the detectives said something that shifted the tone completely. "We understand you didn't kill Randi, but we also know you know who did." And that's when their strategy finally paid off. After a long silence, Brian asked his mother, who was sitting in the room with him, to step outside. Once she was gone, he turned to the detectives and said he was ready to tell them everything, as long as they agreed not to seek the death penalty. The police agreed to the deal, and Brian finally started talking. He admitted that things between him and Randi had gotten pretty bad. He said she was always trying to control him, especially when it came to money. He resented her for it, felt like he could never buy what he wanted, and that frustration had been building up for years. Then he became close friends with Blaine and got excited about the horror movie Blaine had been working on. Brian wanted, and he even helped with the script. The story was about 5 friends who set off on a hike through the Appalachian Mountains. Along the way, they stumble upon an abandoned mining town and accidentally release the vengeful spirit of a dead man who then begins hunting them down. Blaine and Brian had everything lined up for the shoot, but they had one major problem: money. Even though the film was meant to be low budget, they still needed a decent chunk of money for actor salaries, equipment, and other expenses. According to Blaine's estimates, they were going to need over $10,000. Blaine couldn't come up with that kind of cash, so Brian offered to fund the production himself. He planned to use the savings he and Randi had set aside, the money she'd been putting away in case his health got worse. His plan was simple. He and Blaine would make the movie, catch the attention of some big studios, and eventually turn a profit. Once that happened, Brian would pay the money back, with interest. But Randi didn't like that idea. She was skeptical about putting that much of their savings into such a risky project. She also didn't think it was a good idea for Brian to be involved, given his condition. Filming would require him to spend several days out in the Appalachian Mountains, completely off the grid. In the end, Brian had to back out of the film entirely, and Blaine wasn't happy about it. Still, he eventually managed to pull the money. Together, hired some actors, and went off to the mountains to start shooting without Brian. For about a week, he filmed non-stop. And according to everyone involved, Blaine was absolutely thrilled. But behind the scenes, he had a serious problem. To fund the project, Blaine maxed out every credit card he had, including his wife's. She didn't know what he'd done until the bills started rolling in. When she realized he'd racked up over $18,000 in debt, she left him, taking their newborn son with her. Still, Blaine believed the film would fix everything. But now, he couldn't afford to edit it, much less promote it. And without that, the project was dead in the water. That's when Brian stepped back in. He still wanted to be a part of the film and was more than willing to help fund its release. But there was one big obstacle standing in their way: Randi. That's when the two of them started thinking, how could they get access to her savings? And eventually, they came to a horrifying conclusion. The easiest way was to kill her. Over the next few months, Brian and Blaine worked on what they thought would be the perfect murder, pulling ideas from the horror movies they both loved so much. The plan was simple. They'd make it look like Randi had been killed during a robbery, which would also trigger an insurance payout for the stolen jewelry. On top of that, they expected to collect $100,000 from Rye's life insurance. They also knew they had to make sure Brian didn't come under suspicion. On the day of the murder, the two men left work early and went back to Brian's house where they trashed the place to stage the scene. Then Brian drove to a nearby town to meet up with a friend, setting up his alibi. And Blaine stayed behind, waiting for Randi. When she walked through the door, he attacked her. At first, he tried to strangle her with a cord, but Randi fought back harder than he expected. That's when Blaine grabbed a knife and stabbed her, repeatedly. After the attack, he fled the scene and got rid of the rubber gloves he'd worn to avoid leaving any trace behind. About an hour later, Brian returned home and called the police, claiming he'd just found his wife's body. Before wrapping up his confession, Brian admitted he was shocked by just how brutal his friend had been. He said that when they met up a few days after the murder, Blaine described the whole thing in graphic detail, and it actually made Brian feel sick. When detectives asked how he could do something like this to his own wife, a woman who cared for him and planned a future with him, Brian calmly replied that he was just trying to spare her the pain she would have felt from a divorce. With that, Brian was arrested and held in jail while he waited for trial. But for investigators, the case was far from over. Now they had a new challenge, finding solid evidence that could tie Blaine to the murder, because Brian's word alone wasn't going to cut it. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Blaine's car, and inside they found a receipt with some suspicious items. On the day of the murder, Blaine had purchased rubber gloves, work gloves, a black hoodie, and black pants. Police then went to the store and asked staff to check if any other purchases had been made with the same credit card. That's when they got their big break. The system showed that the same card had also been used to buy a large knife. Detectives obtained the exact same model and brought it to the medical examiner, who confirmed that the blade matched the wounds found on Rye's body. But then, detectives ran into an unexpected problem. After speaking with Blaine's friends, they learned that he also had an alibi. Two of his friends claimed they saw him at his apartment around 7:30 p.m., the approximate time of the murder. If that were true, there wouldn't have been enough time for him to get from Rye's house back to his place. The friends also mentioned that after hanging out with Blaine, they stopped at a gas station. Police pulled the receipt to verify the timeline, and that's when they made a key discovery. The time was off. The receipt showed that the friends stopped at the gas station at 8:30 p.m., not 7:30. That meant he had more than enough time to kill Randi and get back home by that time. With all the evidence finally lining up, detectives charged Blaine with murder and placed him under arrest. Up to that point, they'd had almost no direct interaction with him, and when they showed up at his door, Blaine fainted on the spot. Despite all the evidence stacked against him, Blaine refused to confess and kept claiming he was innocent. But as the trial got closer and prosecutors announced they'd be going after the death penalty, he suddenly changed his tune. In exchange for taking that off the table, Blaine agreed to a plea deal. He admitted to killing Randi and said he was hoping to get $20,000 from her life insurance to pay off his debts. In the end, both men were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And to this day, they remain behind bars. After Rye's death, her mother started a non-profit organization dedicated to helping victims of domestic violence. It's still active to this day and has helped hundreds of people in need. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video.